Over the past 5 years, I've recorded hundreds of podcasts, and I want to share with you my process, my 7 steps that I take with every single podcast. I love podcasting. I love the medium. I love listening to podcasts. I love the response I've gotten from podcasts. I love this medium, and I've created probably a dozen different podcasts, and I've created a lot of podcasts for clients as well. So I love podcasting. I want to help you create your podcast. And so my first step whenever I create a podcast is I schedule it. I schedule that interview. I schedule that time. And so sometimes it's just me and a microphone or someone in a microphone. But if I don't put it in the calendar, if I just think I'm going to just get to it whenever I have free time, it probably won't get done. So I put it in my calendar. This is when I'm going to record my podcast. So step 1, schedule it. The second thing that I do is record it. So I schedule it and then I record it. And so when I record it, maybe it's an interview, maybe it's something that we're talking about. And so when I podcast, typically I don't have an outline. I don't have notes. I'll typically schedule an interview or just have a topic that I want to talk about. For me, that's most natural. So some people might have a step in there where they're preparing for it. They're preparing the content. But for me, it's literally just I schedule it and then I record it. And then I have the content ready to go. Now, the third step is not a step that I take, but it's a step that we take on my team, and that's to edit the podcast. Now, there are times where I'll use GarageBand and need to do a quick edit, but I really lean into my team to use all the tools to add a good bumper on the front and to optimize it for each of the platforms. And so editing that podcast is important. And the quality factor that people expect now is high. You know, there was a time where you could just record something on your phone and throw it up in a mobile app and you have a podcast. And while that might reach a handful of people, I think the quality expectation is important. So prioritizing a good capture from a production standpoint, and then prioritize that edit. Make sure you have high quality audio content for your podcast. Now, the fourth step that we take after that podcast is edited and it's ready to go, and that's we publish it. We push the button. Now, we use a platform called Libsyn, and Libsyn has all of our different distribution platforms like Apple Podcast and Google and SoundCloud and Spotify, all in one platform. So we push publish, and then it goes to all of those distribution platforms with that one click of a button. So after it's done editing, it's ready to go. We hit the publish button. Now, the fifth thing that we do is promote it. And so once we've hit publish and it's out there, we want people to know about that podcast. And I don't want to count on Apple or Spotify or all of those platforms to tell people about it. Now, I hope that they'll find it there. But I use primarily my email list is what I found to be the most effective way to drive people to my podcast or to my client's podcast, as well as social media. So we'll immediately put out a post on social media and an email to our list. And typically over the next several days, we'll have several social media posts to help promote that new podcast. Now, the sixth step that we take is we want to measure it. One of the great things about digital media is you can actually know a lot about your listeners. And so one of the reasons I love Libsyn is it gives you pretty good data. Now, audio data from podcasts is still limited in comparison to video data on YouTube or some other digital platforms or website data. But it's still pretty impressive data that you can get of where people are downloading your podcast from or streaming it from and what devices and all of those kinds of things and what browsers they might be in. So getting that data and understanding which podcast performed the best, which one's got the most response, where are people downloading it from, and how do I maybe make it more relevant to those people? And so understanding who's listening and the behavior within your podcast is really important, and it's important to me and something that I'm checking on a weekly basis, if not more often, are the numbers and digging into the analytics and reviewing the response to each and every podcast. And the seventh and final step is to repeat. I do this over and over again. Whenever I finish one podcast, we're preparing for the next podcast to always be ready. That your podcast listeners need a rhythm and they're expectant for that next podcast. And so when they finish one podcast, they're expecting another one. And what you want to do is be consistent and make sure you've created a rhythm that when you're done with your last process, that you're beginning your new process, and it's cyclical. in your content creation process. And with every single one, that I want to do a better job of preparing for that podcast. I want to do a better job recording that podcast. I want to do a better job analyzing the data and better understanding the data so I can be a better podcaster. So that's my process. I hope it helps you. If you have a different process, I would love to know what it is. Share in the comments what your process is when it comes to creating podcasts, and let's learn from each other. Thanks so much for watching this episode.